All right, well, good afternoon. I want to talk a little bit more about the Otto Binder readings and also about the directions for paper number 2. So I'll do that in this video. Please email me if you have any questions. So I really want to talk about two elements of the second paper today. And those two things are, first of all, the way in which you'd be discussing or analyzing the story that you've selected, and also the way that you're using the sources. So let me start with the sources first, because as you know, since you've signed up for the class and you've hopefully read the syllabus and you've read the descriptions of what the course is, one of the major differences between English 102 and then English 101, which you may have taken last semester, maybe you took it a couple of years ago, that depends on what your schedule has been. But one of the biggest differences between them is that English 102 is focused more on using outside sources, research sources, in order to be able to analyze whatever texts or stories that it is that we are reading. And so you're starting to see that with this second paper. Now, you'll notice that unlike other sort of research papers that you've probably written in the past, I've provided you with the resources that you need for this paper. That won't happen with all the essays that we do as we go further into the semester. I'll have you looking things up at the Harper Library database, for example, which you'll be able to do from home. You won't have to go to campus to pick anything up. You can do everything from the computer. Those of you that took me for 101 will remember that we did an assignment that was like that, where we were using some material from the database's research. But for these earlier papers, for paper 2 and 3 especially, I'll give you the sources. So that means that the outside or research sources that you're going to use are ones that I'm providing you with. So in the case of this paper, the source that you use will depend on which of the 5 topics you've selected. And that's why I've mentioned and I've urged you to read the directions for paper number 2, because there's 5 separate choices for this one. And each one has a different focus, and they also use different sources. So what you'll notice is that for each one of the topics, what I've done is I've tried to select a piece of research that I think will help you in analyzing and understanding and in writing about Binder's work. So for example, I've given you a letter that John Campbell, the editor of one of the science fiction magazines that Binder wrote for in the 1930s, wrote to Binder, giving him advice on how to become a better writer. So that's one of your outside sources that you can read. It's a short letter. It won't take you long to read through. There is another source where you have Binder's letter to his friend, Sam Moskowitz, who was another editor and science fiction fan from the 1940s and 50s. And in that letter, Binder talks about his desire to write for a younger audience. He wanted to write stories for young readers that would appeal to them, stories that would appeal to them and would give them a kind of moral sense. And so in that letter, which is also on Blackboard, he explains that. And actually what he's trying to do in that letter is he's trying to convince Moskowitz to publish a new magazine that would be for these younger readers, what today would be called young adult readers, right? So YA books, those books that kind of got their start in the last 20 years with the Harry Potter books, the Percy Jackson and those other kind of series that are marketed and enjoyed by young adult readers. So that's something that Binder was already thinking about as a writer, as a professional writer in the 1940s and 50s. So that's another resource in there. There are 2 comic book versions of the Binder stories that I've put into Blackboard, which again, I consider all of these things to be outside secondary sources. The primary sources are the stories, I, Robot and The Teacher from Mars, because those are the stories we're reading and that we're going to analyze. But to understand them better and to do research on them, it's important to know why a writer wrote these things, where they were getting their ideas from, where they were from to begin with, which is why I talked a little bit in the last video about Binder and his connections to Chicago and his immigrant parents and how that may have influenced him. So all of these elements I think of, and this is the way I approach doing research. When I'm working on an article, when I'm working on, one of the books that I've done, I'm interested in piecing together all of these different research elements, almost like I have a puzzle in front of me. And I've always thought about research like that from the time I was actually your age and taking a class like this. I've always thought of research as being like putting a puzzle together. So you find these different resources and you're trying to create a bigger picture. So in the case of these paper topics, the goal of not just reading I, Robot or the teacher from Mars, but also reading these letters and these other secondary documents. Again, they're not the primary things we're analyzing, but they are there so that you can reach a better understanding of this writer and why he did what he did. Now, you might ask yourself, well, I'm not going to be an English major, so how would this be useful to me? For a couple of reasons. And the first one would be that you'll have other college classes, I'm sure you've already had some, where you're going to be asked to do research. You're going to be asked to get book sources, magazine, journal sources, and you're going to be asked to put that material together, quote from it, and then use it to explain a particular topic that you're working on. I'm sure you've all done papers like that. If not here in college so far, you've certainly done those, I'm sure, in high school before, where you have to collate all this information, absorb it, think about it, and then put it together so that you're explaining whatever topic it is that you're working on. Now, again, because we're an English class, we happen to be focusing on these writers because that's mostly what we focus on in English, are different writers and how they express themselves and what inspired them to tell the stories they did. So when you're doing this paper, the first thing I want you to think about is how you can use whatever outside source I've given you for that particular topic in order to better understand what Binder was doing, and also in order to write a paper in which you can give some context. And that's where the outline for this paper comes in, which I'll talk about in a separate video. There is an outline already on the directions for this paper in terms of how to structure it and where to put the quotations and how to structure things. But in terms of what you're writing about, you're going to use the source, the outside source, in order to develop a thesis and in order to explain the story in some way, okay? And that gets me to my second point that I want to talk about, which allows me now to bring in, as I always like to do every semester, Baby Yoda. This is a different Baby Yoda than I had last semester. We bought this over the holidays. This is why he has a nice scarf on. But I have this Baby Yoda here, and I also have here this Gundam action figure. For those of you that know Japanese comics, manga, or anime, you may know some of these characters. This is a Gundam robotic warrior from a Japanese cartoon and comic series, which I think started in the late 1970s. But at any rate, I have these figures, and I'm showing these to you because I have an alien here, and I have a robot, because that's what we're reading about in these stories, right? If you think about, let's take the robot first, right? Let's think about Adam Link for a second. And the Adam Link story, in terms of thinking about how to analyze this, is about a machine that's been created by Dr. Link to mimic humanity, right? He develops emotions, he develops memories. And in the last video, I mentioned that someone like Binder was writing these stories, number one, because again, as you see in that research material I gave you, he wanted to attract and interest all kinds of readers. In order to make a living, he had to do that. So both younger and older readers had to feel some kind of investment in his stories. And because of that, he was using characters like robots, not only because his readers were interested in them, but also because it was an opportunity for him to develop what I said last time, were allegories. So in other words, you could read his stories, not just these, but other ones that he published over the course of his life, and purely read them for their entertainment, science fiction value. So that means if you're into that kind of stuff, if you're into robots, and you're into aliens, oh, sorry about that, the aliens, well, this alien with a scarf on, then you could read them purely for that enjoyment and say, oh, I want to read about these fantastic worlds that I can imagine myself. I want to read about these characters that don't exist in real life. Well, at least we don't know yet. We don't know where the aliens are, if they've visited us or not here on planet Earth. It sounds like there are some alien off-world microbes perhaps in the atmosphere of Venus, if you've read any of those articles recently where they've done some research on possible other life forms in our galaxy. So the closest we probably have to us would be whatever microbes might be living in the atmosphere of Venus, not on the surface, because that would not be a world on which much could exist. But anyway, that's a tangent. Let me not get into that kind of thing. That would be for a science class. So you could read these stories purely for the entertainment value, about aliens, about robots. But for an allegory to work, it has to contain some kind of moral message, some kind of lesson for the reader. So what I've mentioned before is that Binder often wrote stories that were about the underdog, about people being bullied. We see that I think particularly with Munzero's in The Teacher from Mars. We see that to an extreme example, or to an extreme extent, in Adam Link Robot, because in that one, none of these people believe that he hasn't killed his creator. That didn't happen. He's not a murderer, but they don't know anything about him, so they misjudge him. So that's where we get into the more allegorical level of these stories, beyond simply the, robots and aliens and spaceships and all this other stuff, to the characters. And by doing the research, by reading that letter from John Campbell, the editor, by reading the letter that Binder himself wrote. You can even take a look, if you wanted, the article that I wrote on Binder years ago now. I remember I'd written that piece on iRobot for a friend of mine who teaches at the University of South Carolina, for my friend Kiana Whitted. And I share that with you, not because you need to use that as a source, but if you want to see how I conducted some research on Binder and these kind of writers several years ago, you can kind of see the process and how I cited that material, and also how I used it for that article. So that's in your folder if you want to see how I wrote about iRobot several years ago for, again, for my colleague and friend Kiana. She'd asked me to do that, and I had to do the research. I didn't know much about Binder. I had only read a couple of the stories, and I wanted to understand why he wrote the stories that he wrote. And I partly wanted to understand that because he's a Chicago writer, and I've lived here now, as I've said, for 15 years or so, and I'm curious about these people, how they wrote these stories, especially stories like this that don't seem as realistic at all, in the way that like Dybeck's stories are clearly autobiographical. These stories are very different. He's trying to convey some kind of moral lesson to the reader. And so for me to understand them, when I first started researching them, I wanted to read these letters. I wanted to read all this other secondary material so that I got a bigger picture, what I called before that kind of puzzle. I wanted to piece those things together to understand better what it was that I was reading. So the goal of this second paper, and the goal of even doing these readings, is to get more practice in, to be using secondary sources that help you understand what the stories are, and to use really strong secondary sources, because you can look Otto Binder up, as you probably know, online, and there's a Wikipedia entry for him, and there's other online articles. I mean, mine's just one of them. But if you really want to understand somebody like this, and you really want to do strong research, it's important to dive in and to look at this material that is a little harder to find. These letters, it would be like using a diary, like using old newspaper articles. That's where things get interesting, because you're trying to piece together someone else's life and their experiences and the things that inspire them. And that's partly what we're doing with this paper. So on the one hand, we have these secondary sources where we see why he was writing the stories and he was explaining it himself, or we see other people giving him advice on how to write. In the case of the other article that's up in the folder, why I selected The Teacher from Mars, he tells you very clearly why he wrote the story and what it meant to him and what kind of moral kind of lesson he was trying to get across. But the only way you would know that is if you did that research, if you read the material that I've given you, and you had a better understanding of the world in which he was writing and the themes that were important to him and what he was trying to accomplish. So that other element of your paper is the analytical one. Once you understand more about him by having read these sources and having reflected on them, then you can analyze the story and give your opinion of it. That's important. I should mention that. And I've stressed that in the directions. When you get to the second part of this paper, I want to know what you think. You don't have to love the story. You can give me a paper that says, well, I've done this research and I understand what he's doing, but I don't think it was necessarily effective or successful. And you'll notice in the writing prompts, I sort of build that in as part of the prompt, where I say, well, what is your opinion on this? Did he succeed in creating more human characters, as John Campbell had taught him to do? Did he succeed in creating a story that showed the evils of prejudice and bigotry, as he intended to do with The Teacher from Mars? Did it work? For you as a reader, that's the second part of your paper, is to give me some examples from the story, either of elements that you thought were effective, maybe a character that you thought was interesting, or a sentence, or a theme that came out that you found interesting, or maybe you didn't think they were effective. And it's okay to say that. It's valid to say that. That's where the second part of your paper, no matter which of the 5 topics you select, even the one about the film, where I ask you to imagine what it would be like if you had to adapt this into a movie or TV show, you'd have to decide what you thought of it. Do certain things work? Do they not work in the story? So you're critically evaluating what Binder did in these stories, but your critical evaluations are based on solid research. That's the goal of a paper like this. And that's really the goal of the whole course, is to use these solid documents, these research materials, I guess I should say, to be able to understand and explain these stories in your own words and to give your opinion on them. Okay, that's what I'm asking you to do. So that's why on the surface, we might be thinking we're reading a story about robots or about, this alien from Mars, or, well, I don't think we know in the TV series where Baby Yoda or Grogu is from yet. But what's beneath the surface of that? What else is this writer trying to convey? And for Binder, we know from his letters and from the other research that I've given you that he did have in mind the goal of creating these allegories, stories with some kind of lessons. And why? Because those are the writers that he read. If you go do more research on him, you start to learn that he really liked Charles Dickens, and he really liked Shakespeare and those early science fiction writers that I've also mentioned. And so those were writers also that always had this kind of allegorical element, okay? And so these are some of the things I want you to think about as you're reading through the directions and reflecting on these stories and reading through these secondary sources that I've provided for you. The other thing I want to mention before I wrap up with this video is this paper, and most of the other ones we're going to do, with the exception of maybe one of the rewrites later on where you've already got an existing paper, I really want to urge you to try to start the paper as soon as you can. Now, again, I know everyone's busy, especially under our current circumstances with, we got family obligations, we have work obligations, we have other classes. But this sort of paper will be much easier to write if you just take your time. Don't try to write it all in one sitting because there's too many moving parts. You have to read the sources, then you got to read the story, and you've got to really think about it and absorb some of this. So even if you can sit down for 15 minutes, every day, maybe starting next week, just 10 or 15 minutes, and start to think about the ideas, make a rough outline, and the longer you give yourself, the more time you give yourself to write a paper like this, the better it's going to be. And I say that again as someone with years of experience writing, research articles and even books where it takes time. Again, you might be a faster writer and reader than I am. I would guarantee you probably are, because as I've said many times, I'm fairly slow and meticulous in how I do my own writing. But when you have to do research, you really need that time. It's really not possible to just write things the day before. I know a lot of professional writers that I've worked with in the past, and they tell me the same thing. Just take your time, try to absorb the information, particularly when this information is new to you and you're trying to practice your skills so that you have these skills not only in other classes where they're going to ask you to do research, but also at your job. If you're being asked to do some kind of report for your boss, you need to know how to collate sources, put them together, and come up with some kind of an argument. Maybe even a better example, you might get a speeding ticket someday, or you might get a parking ticket, and you know that it's wrong. I've had this happen to me, and you've got to write a letter to the judge explaining why you were not parked illegally, and you might need to look at what the laws are, what the statutes are, what the ordinances are for that particular parking space. I had to do this a few years ago. I got a ticket where I clearly was in the right. I had my little sticker, on the dashboard of my car. I was not out of time, and yet I still got a ticket. And I realized that whoever had given the ticket just hadn't looked at the time very carefully on the little ticket that I had on my dashboard. And so I had to write a letter, to whatever court it was here in Chicago. And I gave them all the details. I put all my argument in there as to why I did not have to pay this ticket. And I got out of it because, again, I kept all my documentation, and I wrote down I hope a fairly well-written letter to say, no, I don't deserve this ticket. I don't want to spend $75 when I know I was in the right. So all of these skills of getting information together, doing research, they're not going to just help you in your other classes. Now, again, you may never write another paper on a writer ever again after you finish this class, but the kind of research skills that you're going to develop and that ability to kind of systematically go through material, put it together, and create some kind of an argument, you're going to need that no matter what profession you go into, or you're going to need it in your own personal life, going forward. And so that's our job. That's my job, is to help you develop those skills. And we just happen to be using, robots and aliens to do this particular research, because why not write about robots and aliens. You know, it's the middle of February. It's snowing again here outside, and I hope that you get some enjoyment from these stories, because hopefully they're a little bit different. And even if you're not into science fiction, it might just give you another world to imagine that isn't this kind of gloomy midwinter, Chicago kind of snowy environment that we're living in at the moment. Okay, so that's a little bit more on paper number 2 and on the Binder readings. I'll talk a little bit more in the next video that I post on the structure. I'll go through that. That's already on the directions for paper number 2, but you can read those over, and I'll go through that structure again in a separate video. If you have any other questions, please send me an email, and I'm going to go back and answer some more emails. I got to put my Gundam figure and my Grogu back up on the shelf here, and I will see you later. So talk to you then.